So firstly, human trafficking. Now, this is an internationally agreed definition, agreed by the United Nations, and it was adopted by the Council of Europe in 2000. And it's as a result, it's called at a meeting at Palermo. So it's called the Palermo Protocol. So that the definition is as follows: human trafficking has to have three elements: the act, that is what is done; the means, how it's done; the purpose, why it's done. And I would just explain what these three elements mean. But to be human trafficking, it must have the three. So the act is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring, or receipt of persons. So the interesting thing there is the receipt as well. It's not just the people who do the transportation and recruitment. And this is a whole process of recruitment, transportation, etc. Now, one thing to bear in mind, which I think is important, is trafficking can take place within a country's own borders. So whereas smuggling takes place from one country to another, trafficking can take place across borders, but it can take place within borders. For example, within the United Kingdom, we've had a whole spate of trafficking for child sexual exploitation. This is where groups of men recruit vulnerable young girls, often in care of local authorities, that is, when they cannot be looked after by their own parents, and exploit them for sexual purposes. So and then transfer them from one city to another or from one area to another. So that's trafficking, but within the country. Similarly, you may or may not be familiar with the term county lines. This means where criminals will exploit and recruit young people to act as runners for drugs and sometimes weapons as well. So that's trafficking within borders. And how do they do it? Well, by means of threat, force, I won't read them all out, coercion, essentially, etc. It's abuse of power, coercion. Now, the Palermo Protocol refers to these methods to receive the consent of a person. I don't like that term because consent should be in inverted commas. They don't give their consent, they are coerced. But this is the term that's used. Methods are used to get the so-called consent. And then finally, the purpose for why it's done. Well, it's for the purpose of exploitation. And that includes all these things: sexual exploitation, forced labour, etc., etc. Now, in the case of children, a child can never give consent, even presumed consent. Only two elements required: the act and the purpose. But sadly, despite that, as I said, a large number of children are still exploited.